My name is Quinn Meekum. I'm Associate Director here at the Kennedy Center for Research and Academic Programs. And I'd like to share, before we begin with our panelists, a little bit about our book of the semester and why it was chosen. And we know that many of you have had a chance to read it and have enjoyed it. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks was for many, many years the Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom. He was an extraordinarily prolific author, writing more than 30 books in his lifetime, many of which were deeply consequential works at the intersection of philosophy, sociology, religion, culture, and an extremely influential person. He passed away in 2020, November 2020. And one of his last public addresses, it's more of a conversation, actually happened over Zoom during the COVID pandemic here at BYU, hosted by the Wheatley Institution and Paul Edwards. And so I wanted to just share a brief clip of his conversation that he had at BYU just 6 weeks before his death. So we'll roll that first clip if it's okay.
Something like that. But Paul, let me explain why this moment is so special for me. You see, this whole pandemic has not been great. I can think of lots and lots of ways in which we'd rather it never happened. However, for me personally, it has done something absolutely extraordinary. You see, Paul, it must be at least 20 years ago when the elders of your community came to visit me when I was Chief Rabbi in St. John's Wood and asked me to come to Brigham Young University. And I was longing to do so, but somehow we never had the time because from London it's so far. And somehow or other for 20 years, every single year I would think somehow or other, when am I ever going to get to Brigham Young University? And finally, the Almighty has arranged for it to happen in the most unexpected way. And I cannot tell you how moved I am, because as far as I'm concerned, you, your institution, everything that surrounds your faith are absolute role models, intellectually, spiritually, morally, and practically. And I am very, very inspired by all you do.
Thank you. So it is indeed unexpected in many ways that we would be focusing on Rabbi Sacks's book, even posthumously. The book of the semester was written 20 years ago. It was first published in the fall of 2002, and if you were alive then, you may remember that it was a very tumultuous period in world history. It hadn't been too long after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The United States was really trying to figure out how do we think in this country about engaging with very different traditions than ours. And at that point, Rabbi Sacks was motivated to write a book that would try to address what he called the potential for a clash of civilizations. It was a controversial book when it was written. It was controversial in the Jewish community. It was controversial in broader religious communities, in part because his prescriptions seemed to be quite radical and challenge a lot of some of the ways that faith leaders had thought about that particular moment in time. 20 years later, I am not particularly happy to report that the cultural and religious clashes that he was worried about in 2002 have not really gone away. And as I reflect a little bit about, some of the challenges that we face diplomatically, politically, internationally, and culturally in this country and beyond, I still see a great deal of conflict in the world, and a lot of those things that Rabbi Sacks was worried about as he wrote the book are still with us. But his solutions, in many ways, are quite compelling, and we've assembled a group of people who I think are uniquely qualified to think about some of his arguments and some of the things that he wanted to share in 2002 that are relevant for us today. I will just share one page from his book in the concluding chapter that I think helps to synthesize a lot of what Rabbi Sacks was trying to do in this book. He starts by talking a little bit about religious tolerance, and he argues, you have the book, it's page 200, it says, a return to the 17th century concept of toleration is not enough. Something far stronger than toleration is required. I've argued that if we are to find an idea equal to the challenge of our time, it must come from within the great religious traditions themselves. I have tried to articulate one possible form of that idea. It is that the one God, creator of diversity, commands us to honor his creation by respecting diversity. God, the maker of all, has set his image on the person as such prior to and independently of our varied cultures and civilizations, thus conferring on human life a dignity and sanctity that transcends our differences. That is the burden of his covenant with Noah, and thus with all mankind. It is the moral basis of our shared humanity, and thus ultimately of universal human rights. That is why the later covenant with Abraham and his children does not exclude other paths to salvation. The righteous of all nations, those who honor God and his covenant with mankind, have a share in the world to come. Until the great faiths not merely tolerate, but find positive value in the diversity of the human condition, we will have wars, and the cost in human lives will continue to rise. There is nothing relativist about the idea of dignity of difference. It is based on the radical transcendence of God from the created universe with its astonishing diversity of life forms, all of which, as we now know through genetic research, derive from a single source, and from the multiple languages and cultures through which we, as meaning-seeking beings, have attempted to understand the totality of existence. Just as the human situation would be impoverished and unsustainable if we were to eliminate all life forms except our own, so it would be reduced and fatally compromised if we were to eliminate all cultures and traditions except our own. He also says, the test of faith is whether I can make space for difference. Can I recognize God's image in someone who is not in my image, whose language, faith, ideals are different from mine? If I cannot, then I have made God in my image instead of allowing him to remake me in his. At the end of the book, Rabbi Sacks calls his final chapter a covenant of hope, and he talks a little bit about the distinction between contracts and covenants. And in his conversation with the Wheatley Institution in 2020, he also addressed that same thing. So I'd just like to share with you one final clip from Rabbi Sacks himself.
Right. It's about self-interest, a transaction that helps my self-interest and your self-interest. So if I need a mechanic to mend my car, I'd make a contract with him. He mends my car, I pay him. And we're both happy because my car now works and he now has the money that he wanted. So that contract is in both our self-interests, but it does not create any kind of lasting relationship. Once it's been achieved, it's done, and that's the end of it. A covenant is completely different. A covenant is like a marriage. A covenant is a situation in which two individuals come together to pledge themselves to one another in loyalty and fidelity to achieve together what neither could achieve alone. So a covenant isn't about interest, it's about identity. And it does actually transform me because something about my identity is now changed. I am open-endedly connected to someone with whom I've made that covenant, most obviously with in the context of marriage. Now, what I love about America, except that not all Americans love about America, is that America is the most covenant society in all of history. I mean, totally amazing that it was begun with covenants. The Mayflower Compact of 1620 is a covenant. John Winthrop's speech aboard the Arbella is a covenant, beautifully defined by Lyndon Baines Johnson's 1965 inaugural address. They came here, the exile and the stranger, and they made a covenant with this land. Now, I mean, what a treasure this is. I don't know how on earth America can just let it slip, because it has this rich, beautiful intellectual history, and I'm really sorry that people have forgotten it. The thing about a covenant is that it binds us to one another in the shared enterprise of building a society for the sake of our grandchildren yet unborn.
So let me ask.
All right. So I invite you, as we talk today, to just think a little bit about what difference means for covenants and how we interact with each other. I'd like to introduce briefly our panelists. We are very excited to hear today from Rabbi Samuel Spector. Rabbi Spector was born and raised in Seattle, Washington. He attended the University of California, San Diego. He received a master's degree in Hebrew Letters and Rabbinic Ordination from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. Rabbi Spector has become well known in Salt Lake and in the broader Utah community. He is the Chief Rabbi of the congregation Kol Ami in Salt Lake. He has also served as Associate Rabbis of Temple Judea in California. And he is currently a member of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Anyone who's encountered Rabbi Spector knows his great love for people, his remarkable mind, and he is very active in dialogue in Utah between the Jewish communities and the LDS communities. Just recently, he and his wife also took in a 14-year-old Afghani student into their home, and that's been an important experience for them. Dr. Andrew Reed from BYU is also with us, from Religious Education and Church History and Doctrine. He has studied and done research at the intersection between Hebrew studies and Russian studies. He is working on the development and history of relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in different parts of the world. He teaches comparative religion courses here at BYU. And importantly, he chairs the Council on Interfaith Engagement of faculty and students, which is a council for interfaith thought on campus here. Finally, we also have Rosalynde Welch, who is a senior research fellow at the Neal A Maxwell Institute of Religious Scholarship here at BYU. She holds a PhD in early modern English literature from the University of California, San Diego, so you guys have something in common there. She is the author of Ether, A Brief Theological Introduction, and she serves as the Associate Director of the Institute, where she coordinates faculty engagement and leads special research initiatives in religious studies here on campus. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. I've invited each of them to spend about 10 minutes with us, sharing some of their reflections on Rabbi Sacks' book. We will reserve some time at the end also for a brief discussion at the end, and we will end at 1 p.m. today. We're going to start with Rabbi Spector.
There we go. Thank you for having me. So I was asked to provide a Jewish perspective on this book. Let me start off by saying that there really is, that every perspective that a Jewish person gives is a Jewish perspective, not the Jewish perspective. Unlike your faith that I greatly admire, we are very non-hierarchical, and we don't have anybody that speaks for our religion. And in fact, we are taught when two Jews disagree or argue over Scripture for the sake of learning, that's when the divine presence sits between them. And, you know, I think that this is something that not all Latter-day Saints necessarily understand about Judaism, because following Rabbi Sacks' death, I received a very lovely message that I was very confused by from the church, saying to me, Rabbi Spector, we want to send our deepest condolences to you on the passing of Rabbi Sacks. And I was like, well, yeah, I'm bummed. He has great books, and I won't, it's a loss for all of us in that regard. But I think there was some confusion in terms of like a belief that Rabbi Sacks was somebody hierarchically really important in our faith, and while he was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, whatever that means, we don't have anything like that here. I tell folks I'm the chief rabbi of Mill Creek, but you know, I was a little confused by this message, but I understood it in the sense that, of course, when an apostle dies or something like that, it would be appropriate for me to send condolences to my Latter-day Saints friends and to those who work within the church. I had the privilege of meeting Rabbi Sacks on a few occasions, and I've owned and have read many of his books. He was always treating me with dignity, and he was a genius, and it was a tremendous loss for us intellectually when he passed. But this book was met with some controversy in the Jewish world. As was mentioned, it was published in 2002. And while Rabbi Sacks was brilliant, he's also an imperfect messenger. We have, I know that with Latter-day Saints, that there are folks who are part of fringe groups that are a bit more fundamentalist, and they claim that mainstream Latter-day Saints are not really Latter-day Saints. Well, as Jews, I like to think that we're all Jews, anybody who's Jewish, but Rabbi Sacks belonged to the Orthodox sect of Judaism, and which comprises about 10% of the population of American Jews. I can't speak to what it does in terms of British Jews, what it is for British Jews. But 2 years after publishing this book, I think we saw hypocrisy from Rabbi Sacks. The most prominent Reform rabbi, which is the largest branch of Judaism in the UK, passed away, and Rabbi Sacks refused to go to the funeral. And when this got backlash for this, an internal email that he sent got leaked out that told his colleagues that he was going to go, but not to respect this man as a rabbi, but because he was a Holocaust survivor, and that he frankly felt that this man was contributing to the destruction of Judaism and was not promoting real Judaism. So I think he's a hypocrite in some ways. But also with this book as well, he espoused a Spinoza-esque theology in its initial publishing in the first edition, where he talked about how Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century Jewish philosopher, did, of how maybe the Jews received the Word of God with the Torah, and then Christians did later with the New Testament, and then Muslims did with the revelation of the Quran. And had Spinoza been around today, I'm sure he would say that the most recent reincarnation is Latter-day Saints of receiving a new revelation. And so he wrote something like this, and he faced a lot of backlash and was actually summoned by about 20 rabbis to explain himself for this. And in the newer edition of the book, that was retracted, and he claimed it was not a retraction, it was a clarification. Kind of wish he had stuck with his guns. And finally, the kind of issue I have had with Rabbi Sacks, before I get into all the things I like about this book, was that, he talks about politics and religion a good bit. And he talks about how a danger is mixing religion and politics. And I agree and disagree with him. On one hand, we have seen that, like what we see in the Islamic Republic of Iran, that can be dangerous when we live in complete theocracies. However, I think religion needs to focus on matters that are politicized. A Latter-day Saint man once told me that I shouldn't talk about politics and religion. My sermons are known for being fairly controversial. And a British rabbi actually said the same thing to me once. So I asked the Latter-day Saints man, well, what about President Nelson speaking about abortion and same-sex marriage? His response was, those are not political issues. Those are moral issues. And likewise, the British rabbi who told me I shouldn't talk about such things, I asked him, what do you talk about in your sermons? He said, non-controversial issues. Things that we all agree on. Refugees, climate change, gun control. Those were very politicized issues in America. He said, oh, I don't have a bloody clue what I would talk about then. So I think about the words of another famous 20th century Jewish theologian, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and how he separated the two. Religion and politics do go hand in hand because ultimately politics is about our morality, about issues like, same-sex marriage, abortion, climate change, racial justice, and other moral issues, homelessness. And what Heschel would do is he would speak out about, he was very anti-Vietnam War, but so he spoke about that from a religious, moral perspective. But he didn't speak at all about what the withdrawal policy should be. He said, that's up to politicians. It's my job as a religious figure to speak of the morality on the issue. And so that's what I try and do. Now, we might have some differing views on this, but like what I share too, what I wrote down also, is that in this vein, a difference between, when we look at the Zionist movement, we see that political Zionism came to its realization on May 14th, 1948. That was that there would one day be a Jewish state in the homeland of the Jewish people. And that dream was realized. Political Zionism is now dead. However, there's another form of Zionism called cultural Zionism. And cultural Zionism can never be accomplished. And because what the idea of cultural Zionism is that we need to perfect the Jewish state to be reflective of our Jewish values. Now, why that can't ever be accomplished is because for some people, their Jewish values are, let me pick again on the issue of same-sex marriage. There are very prominent rabbis who are vehemently opposed to same-sex marriage and say this is a complete affront to our Jewish values, and other rabbis who are strongly in support of it and say this goes hand in hand with our Jewish values. And so therefore that can never be accomplished. I have a few minutes, so let me cut to the chase. So a good thing that Rabbi Sacks focuses on in this book is the issue of globalization. And globalization as Jews gives us the opportunity to complete our mission of what's called tikkun olam, repairing the world. And also, as the prophets say, be a light unto the nations of the world. Now, good and bad can come of that. With a new COVID variant, can spread to every country on earth within a week. And past pandemics were not like this when we were less global. But also, we can spread a vaccine around the world and eradicate diseases, too, and share ideas. We see, too, with globalization, ideas like political ideologies spreading throughout the world. Zionism popped up at the same time that other nationalist movements were starting. And in recent years, we've seen things such as popularist leaders rise throughout the world. And also, when I was living in the Middle East, the Arab Spring came up. And we saw that that went throughout the Arab world, but also to the non-Arab world. That the largest protests were actually in Iran. And that percentage-wise, the largest people protesting were in Israel, all at the same time, who found inspiration from others. Now, globalization and finding dignity in difference are also appreciating common problems that we have. And so, with finding dignity in difference, this has benefited the Jewish people immensely. This has allowed the state of Israel to build relations with African nations in recent years by bringing mobile circumcision clinics to Africa to help combat HIV and AIDS, as well as sharing solar technology. And with the recent Abraham Accords, there was the common threat of a nuclear Iran and also the lack of water throughout the Middle East, while Israel has developed technology that they can share throughout the world in exchange for peace. A famous quote is that Israel's greatest natural resource is their mind. Now, and also, we have to think about how what we do today benefits and harms people throughout the world. If I am leaving my car just running for an hour, that's going to affect people throughout the entire world, not just here. Let me get quickly to the idea of Judaism as well, and how Judaism perfectly coincides with what Rabbi Sacks was talking about in his book. So Judaism identifies, I think, the issue of dignity of difference correctly, and also, well, Sacks identifies this correctly, and Judaism is uniquely positioned for finding dignity in difference, I think, as opposed to many other faiths. And the reason for that is that we are a particularistic faith. We do not proselytize, we do not send missionaries out, we don't try to convert people to Judaism. Judaism is something for us. However, despite being a particularistic religion, we believe in a universal God, that I do not get certain perks in afterlife because I'm Jewish that other folks don't get. For other religions, there might be a celestial kingdom, or there might be a concept of heaven or hell, and we don't have anything like that, that I get perks for being Jewish. And also, we believe in universal ethics. Rabbi Sacks touched on the 7 Noahide laws that are things that we all have to abide by, whether we're Jewish or not. And this gives us the opportunity to see that there is nothing wrong with anybody who is a part of any other faith. And I'm not trying, and it's against my religion to try and convert them, and they're given an equal share in what we call the world to come, whether they're Jewish or not, so long as they are good people. And Rabbi Sacks also points out correctly that, interestingly, a lot of people think the Torah should start at Genesis chapter 12 with Abraham. But no, it starts with creation and Adam, who was not Jewish. Because it's important to make clear that we're all God's children and created in God's image and likeness. The Jewish theologian Martin Buber talks about his famous theology was I and thou, and how we have to create what are called I-you relationships with people, not an I-it relationship where somebody is an ends to a means, or means to an end, excuse me. And so, with that, globalization gives us the opportunity to have I-thou relationships. You see this among Latter-day Saints as well, that you can spread your message and your gospel more easily around the world than maybe you could 100 years ago. That every time I go to Salt Lake City Airport, there are people who are going all over the world to spread the gospel. And that's amazing. We can, as a result of increased travel, increased interaction, and you didn't mention in my bio, I was actually Time Magazine's 2006 Co-Man of the Year. We all were. It was you. And so I found my resume. And the reason why is that this was a time when we all could share we live in a time where we can upload anything on TikTok, YouTube, whatever, and we can inspire each other. And so, as a result, we see increased, I got 1 minute left. So we see increased travel, increased connection with each other in the building of IU relationships. Believe it or not, with this, something that tremendously benefited the Jews was Al Jazeera television. Why? Because when they were reporting on what a horrible place Israel is, they were showing Israelis on TV, and people who had never seen Jews before and thought Jews had horns saw that no, Jews look just like you and me. But also, it gives us the opportunity through globalization to create more I-it relationships by exploiting cheap labor around the world for consumers. So, in conclusion, what I would say is that with the dignity of difference, I like the title a lot because for us, I think that a challenge in interfaith work is that other faiths do not have a universal God like we do. And so I think people from other faiths, when I do interfaith work, often try to come together and see what our commonalities are to see me more human than perhaps they would have. Like, oh, I'm a Latter-day Saint, and I like pizza. You're a Jew, and you like pizza. Yay, kumbaya. And for us as Jews, we aren't so interested in that. Many of us like focusing on differences and confrontation in order to gain understanding. It allows us to have a greater understanding of each other. And our tradition teaches us that God did not just speak to us. Rather, Balaam, who was not Jewish, was a prophet. And Moses' greatest advisor was his Midianite father-in-law, Jethro. And this concept of ability, the dignity of difference, in a lot of ways, it gives us the ability as Jews to adapt to the world we live in. Sometimes in scary ways. You go to ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Israel, they have signs that say, don't come into our neighborhoods, because they don't want their kids to see somebody dressed in jeans and whatever and say, why am I different? But also, Judaism, through the ability of spreading ideas, has been key for us to survive. When our temple was destroyed, we created synagogues. When our priesthood was abolished, we created the rabbinate. When we were expelled from Spain and faced pogroms, we created Hasidism to find new ways to connect to God. And after the Holocaust, we created the State of Israel to have a place where we could be safe. And now we're trying to figure out what the next step is in a post-COVID world. But finally, and the last thing I'll say is that Judaism really appreciates the dignity of difference because one of our quotes from a 2,000-year-old book on ethics, a Pirkei Avot, asked the question, who is wise? And the answer to the question it gives is the one who can learn from every person. So you gave me 15 minutes. I did 16 minutes, which for a rabbi is 13 minutes. So hope you enjoyed.
Thanks, Rabbi Spector. I enjoyed. Oh, there we go. That'll work.
Like that.
I'm grateful to be here sitting between these two fellow interlocutors. I'll say before I start, I've had an allergy, irritated throat. If I'm very, very unlucky today, I'm going to start coughing and I have to excuse myself, in which case I'll just ask Andy to continue. But cross your fingers for me that I get through it. Quinn kindly invited me to reflect today on what I found to be the most important element of Rabbi Sacks's book, The Dignity of Difference. And what I think is most central, most important, most compelling about the book is Sacks's understanding of religion's crucial role in nourishing civil societies. So the rabbi shows how religion complements free markets and political systems in the communal project that we all share together of creating stable, open, diverse, and prosperous societies. And so he outlines a number of religions' complementary roles in this regard. Religion complements the market's contractual relationships with covenantal relationships, as we heard him discussing earlier. Coincidentally, Ari Berman, who's the president of Yeshiva University, in a recent Deseret magazine roundtable on religion in higher education, makes this very same point. The richness and the depth of covenant relationships that can't be matched by contractual relationships. Religion complements markets' unparalleled ability to alleviate material poverty in communities with its own ability to alleviate the social impoverishment of communities. Religion complements modernity's I with communities' we. So in all these ways, religion plays a role alongside the other great institutions and motors of the modern world, complements and supplements what those motors can do with its own unique contributions. But for religions to be the needed partner, Sacks argues, it has to carefully direct its power. So just as markets have proven their kind of unparalleled ability to alleviate poverty, religion has shown its unparalleled ability to create belonging. But both of these powers, to create wealth and to create belonging, can be wielded irresponsibly by bad faith actors. And so Sacks cautions that both the market and religion, their unique capacities and powers to create in the world, need to be used with wisdom. So to that end, he offers what, for me, was the most compelling section of the book. No surprise, I'm a reader of Scripture. Chapter 3, which he titles Exorcising Plato's Ghost. So Sacks compares sort of narrow, intolerant, in-group identity, what he tends to call tribalism. He compares that on the one hand with, on the other, a kind of totalizing moral universalism. And finds that both of these, both a kind of narrow tribalism and a totalizing universalism, are equally dangerous, he says. Universalism is an inadequate response to tribalism and no less dangerous. This is because universalism offers no space and no face for difference, right? This leaves no room for private conscience, for sincerely held religious and ideological diversity. So Sacks shows us that we need to thread this needle, and it's a tricky one. On the one hand, we have to affirm universal humanity and dignity of the human race, right? So we don't want to give up on universalism as the family of God. On the other hand, we must somehow foster the goods of religious belonging while allowing for real difference to coexist peacefully in a pluralistic world. So in service of this goal, he offers what I find to be a really compelling and unique reading of the first book in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis. So he finds in Genesis this trajectory of growth, of moral growth, from a sort of initial and early affirmation of the diversity of creation through a kind of misguided human attempt at universalism, and finally culminating in the needle-threading particularism of the covenant of Israel. So he sees this, as Sam alluded to, initially in the covenant with Noah, where God covenants with all humanity, equally all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people, represented there in the precursor figure of Noah, and in doing so implicitly endorses a kind of pluralistic world. He then reads the episode at the Tower of Babel as a kind of misguided human attempt with one language and with a kind of technological hubris to impose this kind of totalizing universalism on the world. And he then sees the covenant with Moses at Sinai as finally arriving at particularism, which, as Samuel described here, kind of does both at the same time as he sees it. Particularism, Jewish particularism, makes a covenant with all of humanity, then turns to one people and commands it to be different. And in doing so, teaches humanity to make space for difference. God may at times be found in the human other, the one who is not like this. So this is Sacks's reading of his own religious text, one that kind of grapples with religion's dangerous power to create belonging and finds from it a vision of the difference of dignity. The dignity of difference, and he then challenges all religions to find within their own religious texts the similar resources, right? Resources that in no way dilute the power of religion to create real bonds, covenant relationships, but at the same time create this space for difference. So very briefly, I'll just outline what I see as the most promising Latter-day Saint resources in this regard. Of course, we have the 11th Article of Faith, which notably affords to all people the privilege we claim as our own, namely to worship how, where, and what we may. But beyond that, we have in the Book of Mormon, in its drama of religiously mediated ethnic confrontation, against the background of the narratively dominant Nephite Christianity, we find charismatic characters like Abish, Samuel the Lamanite, who illustrate, in Sacks's words, the possibility of other people's cultures and faiths finding their own relationship with God within the shared frame of the Noahide laws, or as the Book of Mormon would understand it, the kind of the light of Christ. The Pearl of Great Price and its midrashic commentary on the Hebrew Bible places God's original covenant to all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people even more foundationally in salvation history. It moves it back from the flood of Noah back to the foundation of the world, the new and everlasting covenant that was instituted there before the creation. It also shows us and reveals an embodied God. And we could talk about this forever. I won't. But I think that this theology of the embodied God radically revises the character of our theological universalism in a way that I think Rabbi Sacks would find fruitful. And finally, the Book of Mormon, in some important senses, can be read as a kind of single, astonishing elaboration of the Isaianic vision that Sacks talks about. This vision of all nations worshiping the God of Israel in harmonious community, having taken their own routes to God and in a kind of eschatological unity, coming together in their particular and yet shared worship. The Book of Mormon amply affirms what Sacks calls particularist monotheism's really special conceptual capacity to simultaneously honor the dignity of difference and honor God as the maker of the universe and the author of all salvation and all mankind.
Great. Well, this is a lot of fun. I wish I had time for this. But I have a couple of thoughts that I want to sort of maybe throw out here, and then we'll see if there's time for a little conversation. My experience with Rabbi Sacks, was started actually in 2006. I first encountered this book as an undergraduate student here at BYU in 2003. And met him in 2006 at the Center for the Study of Jewish-Christian Relations at Cambridge, which is now the Wolf Institute. And it was during that time that I had a conversation with him, and I don't remember the exact question I asked him, but his answer was really quite profound to me. He said, "You really cannot measure the impact of a human life by what's written on paper. A human life is so much more." And that idea has stuck with me, and I think this book is sort of hinting at that in really important ways that I want to kind of tease out a little bit. But coming to reread this book 20 years after its publication is both exhilarating but also kind of haunting. As I think about what he was writing about 20 years ago, he talked about globalization and its effect of making us feel as if we are on a journey without a map in a car that's out of control. And as I think about that, I don't know that 2002 even could touch what we feel in 2022. In some ways, I think about that 2002 representation as sort of some kind of cartooned depiction of Eden or something that maybe feels much more safe than what we feel now. Given the rise of things like Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, when messages can be dispersed rapidly for good or for evil, I think it's important for us to recognize that we are living in a world that globalization 20 years on from what he was thinking about looks even different and more challenging perhaps than what he would have imagined for us. And so I would propose that really there's two big points that I would like to kind of point out from his book. The first one is that religion can be a source of incredible discord, and it can also be a form of conflict resolution. And an instrument for conflict resolution. I think that's important. I think that aligns a lot with what the Kennedy Center is interested in thinking about this semester, but also causes us to think through what he says there. Because as I was thinking about why religious communities, why do they matter in this notion of globalization, he argues that one thing that religion offers us is it allows for people who are not who've not devoted their life to the noise of now, but rather to the music of eternity, which I think is an interesting concept. What does that mean, though? It means that we can't ignore what's going on now. We still have to utilize the instruments that are provided by that music of eternity in ways that force us to deal with the problems that we face in the world. And some of those problems are deep and profound, and some of them are caused by religion. And so that that challenge for us is there. I was recently on Twitter, of course, the source of all good information, and a friend and colleague of mine posted a question or a survey there for his followers, and he said, "What is the thing that bothers you most or concerns you the most right now?" And you had three options. You could choose Christian nationalism, nuclear war, or climate crisis. None of those are very fun to think about.
You have to make a choice. Okay.
You have to make a choice. It's one of three choices. But as I was thinking about that, this idea that as religious individuals in the world, we don't get to opt out of thinking about the now. We still have to worry about it. And I think one of the problems that Christianity and Islam face in ways that maybe Judaism doesn't, we'll have to think about this over lunch or something, but is that Judaism has a kind of particular approach. Christianity and Islam have a universalizing approach. And so the way in which we read world history and the way in which we read humanity has a kind of universalism to it that I think is problematic for thinking about the world here and now, because we want to kind of fit everything into a box that makes a lot of sense in terms of our relationship with deity. The second point is that peace is a paradox. As we think about what Rabbi Sacks is doing with this idea of peace as a paradox, is simply the notion that he's thinking in a post 9/11 world, and I think the kind of religious extremism and even political extremism that we were looking at then is not the same thing as maybe we're looking at now. He was thinking about tribalism in a certain context, and he notes something. He says, one way or another, religion is and will continue to be a part of these processes. It can lead us in the direction of peace, but it can equally and with high combustibility lead us to war. Politicians have power, but religions have something stronger. They have influence. Politics moves the pieces of the chessboard. Religion changes lives. Peace can be negotiated around the conference table, but unless it grows in ordinary hearts and minds, it does not last. It may not even begin. As I think about that, that's a kind of haunting message from Rabbi Sacks. In another book that he wrote that it had a profound impact on me as well, he says, too often in the history of religion, people have killed in the name of the God of life, waged war in the name of the God of peace, hated in the name of the God of love, and practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion. When this happens, God speaks, sometimes in a still, small voice, almost inaudible beneath the clamor of those claiming to speak on his behalf. What he says at such times is not in my name. And that call, I think, for religious people is important. We often do try to speak for God, I think, publicly and in private. And I sometimes worry that our assertions of what is certain and what is sure, we sometimes speak too strongly on those points, as if we know the mind of God in ways that I think oftentimes we don't. And so one of the things that I think Rabbi Sacks is asking is to really consider this idea of what is a civilization. I don't love Samuel Huntington's notion of the class of civilizations. I've always been a little bit bothered by that. I don't think we usually act in or think of ourselves as civilizations. But yet Rabbi Sacks does put in there, he says, there is nothing inevitable about the survival of civilizations. That should haunt us. That should cause us to pause, even if we can argue about whether Huntington was right or not. But and finally, the last point that I want to kind of focus on is simply in the last chapter, he comes to this idea of optimism versus hope. He says optimism doesn't necessarily ask much of us, right? Optimism can be a passive approach to the world, where he says the covenant of hope is something that, for religious people, connects us to doing something more in the world, connects us to doing what God is calling upon us to think about. And he says hope is the belief not that God has written the script of history, that he will intervene to save us from the error of our ways, but simply that he is mindful of our aspirations with us in our fumbling efforts, that he has given us the means to save us from ourselves, that we are not wrong to dream, wish, or work for a better world. I think that's profound. This idea of hope in the world is inviting us to be partners with God. And I think that's something that Judaism talks quite a bit about in this notion of tikkun olam, for example, right? That we have some work to do in the world, and it's connected to what God's doing, but it's also something that we have to be doing. And that moves us away from that notion of optimism as a kind of passive event, but hope as a sort of active engagement with the world. And finally, the test that he offers us is, can we make space for difference? as we do that, I think we have to ask ourselves a number of questions. It's not too hard to look into something like the Russian rhetoric on Ukraine and realize that proximity allows the notion of an imagined civilization to do some incredibly powerful and damaging things in the world, to re-narrate history in a way that allows for, well, to go back to the Twitter survey, the potential for nuclear war. Right? I think that's a deeply problematic space. Further, I think Rabbi Sacks is inviting us to consider difference not just globally, but also within our own communities. Do we have the capacity in our own community to expand the boundaries of what it means to belong? And can we then become partners in the process of peace, hope, and charity? I think that's a great call from Rabbi Sacks. And so there's a lot in the book to really force us to pause and wonder what we can do more to kind of meet his call. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I know some of you may need to get to class. We've just got a few minutes, and I would like, in those remaining minutes that we have, just to pose our panelists a question that hopefully will synthesize some of the takeaways that, from this conversation. And that question is this: how are you different, or how do you think about the world differently, having engaged with this book, than you were before? If that proves a hard question to answer on the spot, you can also reflect on what question are you asking yourself now that you need to answer as a result of reading the book. And we'll take anybody in any order.
I can start. There's a wonderful phrase that really will stick with me in this book, and it's the choreography of altruism. So in his vision of the way that the modern world works together, there's a role for religion, there's a role for the markets, there's a role for the military, there's a role for political systems, for science, and religion has something unique that it brings to the table, right? That none of these other systems or sites can substitute for, and they've tried, and I think we see that nothing else is able to create the sense of belonging and connection that religion can. And so while the altruistic impulses may be universal in human beings, it needs a choreography. It needs a form, right? And that is what religion can do. It can provide these forms that we can turn to exercise the kind of leavening altruism that makes these other sites of the world system be able to function in their unique capacities as well.
Well, I'll just say that for me, it was interesting to come back and read this book after 20 years. I didn't realize quite what the impact was that it had on me as an undergraduate student, and maybe this is a lesson for undergraduate students is, be careful what you read, because I didn't realize how much of my own language and thinking kind of is this book in terms of some of my own research and interest and even teaching. And so I think there's something, it became a kind of highly reflective moment for me coming back to this book, thinking about sort of how unaware I was of the impact that Rabbi Sacks and his thinking had on me. So.
All right. For the Jewish guy in Utah, how are you different? I mean, this book was written through a Jewish lens, and so much of it I found myself going, yeah, that's what I think, I agree with that, and sort of reinforcing those ideas. What I'm going to work on from this and sort of take this is, I think it's important, not just, I think especially over the last few years, it's been easy to feel a lot of despair about our world, and we're also exposed to more of the darkness in our world. But we have to take advantage too of the opportunity that we can see goodness in our world, and it be and have exposure to more goodness in our world. Last month I had an incredible privilege of joining Governor Cox's delegation to Israel and the United Arab Emirates, which, by the way, pre-Abraham Accords, it was a complete fantasy that I could take a direct flight from Tel Aviv to Dubai, flying over Saudi Arabia. And I was able to bring back a lot of ideas and information of things that could help our community, and also able to contribute some as well. And next month I have a privilege of going with actually Latter-day Saints group to Azerbaijan and Georgia and Armenia to do interfaith work. And while I'm over there, the Jewish communities of those countries are very similar population-wise and just in how they operate to the Jewish community here in Utah. And so being able to hopefully share some things with them that can help them and learn from them as well. So I think what I take from this book is, again, a focus on globalization and how it can be a dangerous thing, but through, as people of faith, we have an opportunity that has never existed before to make a more broken world a much holier world than has ever been if we do it appropriately.
Thank you so much. I invite you, as you leave here today, to imagine the possibilities in your own life for expanding the ways that you engage with others, and also participating in that covenant of hope that Rabbi Sacks concludes with. Thank you so much to our panelists. Please join me with a big round of applause.